Can Samantha and Will escape the pack's dangerous grasp? And what unforeseen consequences will arise from their potential departure? With every twist and turn, who can they really trust in a world filled with deceit and betrayal? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 51: A Liability. I started to thank her, but before I could utter a word, Goldie was gone. She left me standing in front of Will's open door with nothing to stop me from entering. Instead of barging through the door though, like I had wanted to all this time, I hesitated. I lingered in the hallway for what felt like an eternity. For some reason my feet wouldn't move. The door to Will's room was wide open. There was no longer anything holding me back from running to my brother. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk forward and face him. Will's heavy breathing could be heard from inside the room, but it did little to comfort me. The only thing I could think of was what he looked like the last time I'd seen him. He was nowhere close to my brother. He wasn't even human, not in the rawest sense. He'd been a pure animal fighting to break free, and I was too afraid to see if it had one. I shifted on my feet, glancing down the hallway where Goldie had disappeared. It was silent out here, as if all activity in the house had stilled. The only noise to be heard was the heavy breaths of my brother, and the pounding of my own heart. I shifted my feet again, and this time the floor creaked. The breathing inside the room faltered, and before I could stop myself, I stepped forward. Every ounce of sanity left me as I pushed aside all my fears, knowing the only way to face them was to pretend they didn't exist. At least not for now. The room was dark. There was no window in here, only a small light bulb hanging from above. It wasn't turned on, and the only source of light came from the hall. The bedroom was small. A twin-sized bed took up the length of a back wall, and a wooden chair was placed next to it. There was a pile of blankets at the foot of the bed, and another mound on top of it. It moved up and down with the rhythmic breathing of a body, buried beneath countless duvets. My feet carried me into the room. With a thud, the door shut behind me, and all light was eliminated from my surroundings. The figure on the bed moved, and for a fearsome moment, I stood rooted in place. Then the figure groaned, and that fear was washed away. I scurried forward and knelt next to the bed, pushing aside the wooden chair. It made no sound as it scratched the wooden floor, but at the movement Will shifted. His hand fell off the side of the bed, and before I could stop myself, I reached forward to grab it. A nonsensical grin spread across my face, and my chest tightened. When my fingers curled around Will's, his breathing stopped. His hand went stiff, tightening substantially. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't care to breathe anyway. It would only serve as a distraction. Silence filled the room. Will turned his head to face me. His eyes fluttered open, and when they did, my blood ran cold. Will wasn't staring back at me. He was gone, and in his place were glowing red eyes. They flashed through the darkness, staring at me from the face of my brother. His features were stiff and confused, and his eyes narrowed. His tight grip on my hand was suddenly crushing. His narrowed eyes were a cold glare. I was brought back to countless painful memories, each sending a wave of panic crashing against my chest. Just as I was ready to succumb to it, a strained voice cut through the silence. "Samantha." It was Will's voice. There was no denying it. Though tired, strained, and lifeless, it was his. My body stilled, and there was a break in the waves of panic. A small moment that allowed me to lift my head up for air. I choked on a sob. "Will. It's me." All at once, the red eyes were forgotten. They didn't matter. What they meant didn't matter. All that mattered was what was before me, my brother. Not a wolf, not a human, but Will. He was alive. He was conscious. Most importantly, he was speaking. The sob escaped my lips. I buried my face in Will's captive hand as he shifted his weight, pulling his body up on the bed. After a moment, I helped him and positioned the blankets to cover his body. He was shivering, shaking with every breath. "What are you?" he broke off the middle of his sentence, taking a needed breath. "Doing here?" My tears turned into a momentary smile. "I came to get you out of bed." Something resembling a chuckle left his lips. He settled against his headboard, leaning his head back while struggling to breathe. "Can't I have 5 more minutes?" Though our tones were light, I could sense the truth behind Will's statement. The effort it took him to sit up was monumental, and it showed even in the dark. His hand was no longer curling into mine. but growing limper with every passing second. His body shook almost violently, though he hid it beneath the countless layers of blankets. I lifted Will's hand back onto the bed and placed it on his chest, giving it a small squeeze. Only if you really need it. I don't know. Will took another breath. I've been asleep for a while now. You haven't missed much, I shrugged, resisting the urge to look back at the heavy metal door, locking us inside. He snorted and looked around the room. The sound brought back dozens of memories, causing another slew of tears to cascade down my cheeks. No, not much at all, Will mocked. A silence stretched for a moment before he breathed. Where are we? I bit my lip. The pack house. Hasn't anyone spoken to you? He shook his head. Not really. They haven't told you anything. His voice was suddenly grave. I didn't say that. My eyes were adjusted to the darkness now, and I searched Will's features. His eyes were closed, but his face was anything but relaxed. His brow was furrowed until it seemed that every inch of his forehead was covered in permanent lines. A grimace replaced his once light smile. What did they tell you? Will took a deep breath before responding. They told me enough. Filled in the blanks. I know why I'm here. My hand reached out for his arm, squeezing it lightly. And how are you feeling about it all? He tried to shrug, but when the movement became a burden, he slumped further into the bed. They said the worst is over. That doesn't tell me much. Well, I'm not one to talk about feelings now, am I? I suppressed a grin, masking it with a scowl. Will, I'm alive, he interrupted my protests. That's all there is to talk about right now. Then, before I could disagree again, he took a needed breath and changed the subject. Why are you here? To see you. No. Another breath. He told me you were staying down the hall. Why? I bit my lip, wondering if I could just ignore the question. When it was clear Will wasn't going to take silence for an answer, I bent my head and sighed. That's a long story. Will nodded and tried to shrug again. I'm all ears. It can wait. Until you get better, at least. Samantha. Yes. Just tell me. And I did. I told him everything. Everything that happened from the moment he landed in the hospital until he woke up as a wolf. I told him about the day I met Samuel. I told him how James disappeared. I relayed the story of how I ran and almost got away. Then I explained the chaos that ensued in the days leading up to his shift. The death of Riley, the gunshots, and Bray. Then I stopped. The events that happened after Will shifted I decided to leave out for the moment. The last thing he needed was a bomb dropped on his blissful ignorance. When I finished, Will was quiet for a moment. He took his time responding, as was usual for him. Then he mumbled, sounds like you had enough happen for the both of us. A mixture of a groan, cry, and laugh escaped my lips. You have no idea. And how are you doing? His question caught me off guard. What? I asked. He took another breath. How you are doing with it all? Fine. Will nodded and hummed. Before he could open his mouth again, I pushed forward, desperate to do anything but discuss my current state. You should get some rest. You're avoiding the question. I'm not. If you get to ask me about my feelings, I should get to ask you about yours. It's a simple courtesy. He smirked. Don't I deserve an answer? I've been in the dark for a while now. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. I did tell you my feelings. Back in the hospital. It's not my fault you couldn't hear me. Will's eyes found my own. My breath hitched for a moment as the glowing red tried mock me into a panic. Then Will shrugged. The movement was more successful than before, and a smile fell upon his face. We can talk later, I guess. You're not off the hook, though. I nodded, grateful that he was dropping the issue. I'm just down the hall. Get some sleep and I'll come back. I started to stand but was stopped when his hand reached out for mine. Samantha. I turned to look at him, only to stare into those piercing red eyes. A phantom pain stabbed my side, but then Will spoke, and it was as if the red eyes didn't exist. You're stronger than you think, Will mumbled. He dropped his hand and turned away from me, pulling the blankets back over his head. Come back soon, okay? I smiled. Okay. I left the room, softly closing the door behind me. I walked away from the door, but before I got far, I stepped on something cold. I lifted my foot up only to see a small metal contraption that resembled a key. My glance went back to Will's room, and after a moment of hesitation, I picked up the key and locked him inside. The worst of his shift may be over, but I wasn't going to be the cause of someone losing another life, even if the chances were slight. Not again. After locking the door, I wandered back down the hall to my room. My feet paused outside it, but instead of going inside, I turned the opposite direction. I didn't know what I was doing, and for once I let my body take control. My heart was lighter after my interaction with Will, and I was more than willing to let that feeling linger. I ambled down the hall, taking care to watch for others. However, the place was deserted. I didn't know what time it was, how many days had passed, or what was supposed to be happening in the house. I'd lost track of it all. For all I knew, it could be the middle of the night and everyone was asleep. With that in mind, I journeyed deeper into the house. I took the familiar route back to the main hallway, pausing at every corner to listen for voices or footsteps. I never came across any, and before I knew it, I was at the opening into the main part of the house. It looked different, deserted. Though there were no people, the lights were still on. The windows had curtains drawn over them, shutting out the night and prying eyes. All doors were shut, and a fire was burning on embers in the hearth. I glanced around the room before my gaze landed on the kitchen, the opposite side of the staircase. Almost on cue, my stomach grumbled and I was moving toward it. The kitchen matched the rest of the house, the only difference being that the floor wasn't wood, but a dark and smoothed over stone. It matched the countertops that wound around the room, an island separating the kitchen from the living area. I walked silently into the kitchen, making my way straight for the fridge. As soon as I reached the edge of the kitchen, though, I stopped dead in my tracks. Peyton was sitting on one of the bar stools at the far edge of the island. The curtains of the windows were open behind him, giving me a glimpse into the forest blanketed in darkness. Bray blended into that darkness, despite the light shining in the kitchen. Samantha, he stated, surprise etching his features. He placed a mug on the counter, pushing it away from the edge. What a pleasant surprise. My feet were instantly walking away from him. There was something in his smile, something about his tone, that told me this wasn't going to be pleasant. Bray stood. Where are you going? And without your mate, nonetheless. My feet stopped moving despite my mind screaming at me to run. Peyton waited for my answer, and after a quick glance around the kitchen, I responded. I was getting water. I thought everyone was asleep. I'll leave. I stayed rooted in place despite my statement. Peyton noticed and smiled. The friendly expression did nothing but send ice pouring down my back. Do not leave on my account. Take a seat. I will get the water. He turned his back to me, walking around the counter to the fridge. Only when he turned away did I look around and back into the living room. Like before, the room was deserted. I was alone. Bray faced me again, brandishing a bottle of water and a cold smile. He held it out to me, but this time my feet obeyed. I stayed frozen in my spot, wrapping my arms around myself. He tilted his head, a childish frown replacing the smile. I thought you were thirsty. I shook my head. I'm actually just fine. I should be going. Shame. Peyton dropped his gaze and began toying with the water bottle. You'll be needing your strength. My composure faltered. I hesitated, and it was just enough time for Peyton to know he had me in his reins. A smirk played on his features, though he tried well to hide it. I bit my lip and tried to find some control over the situation. What did you say? I said you will be needing your strength. Peyton placed the water back on the countertop, catching my eyes. For what exactly? The next full moon, of course. My breathing hitched. Every fiber of my being was now screaming at me to run, to get away from Bray, but I couldn't listen. Not after what he'd just implied. What are you talking about? Bray's face fell. He broke eye contact and picked the water up again. A breath of air puffed out his cheeks, and he leaned forward on the counter, tossing the bottle between his hands. I had assumed you were informed. Anger bubbled beneath my skin. Of what? Peyton shook his head. It is a shame. That sort of thing should be discussed mutually between mates. I cannot imagine what Samuel was thinking. If you're going to be cryptic, I'm leaving. We both knew that wasn't true. Peyton had me exactly where he wanted me. I wasn't fooled by his pitying expression, nor the false kindness he exuded. He was toying with my emotions, waiting for me to beg for the knowledge he held. Bray's smile returned, colder than before. My apologies, Samantha. I had only assumed that because you and your mate are so close, He would have told you of his plans. They truly are a wonder. There is no doubt he will make his mark on the pack. He is not my mate, I seethed, letting my anger get the best of me. No. Peyton mused. Then I imagine this next month will be extremely difficult for you. I waited for him to elaborate. Of course he refused. After a minute I clenched my jaw and asked why. It is easier for humans to complete the shift with a mate at their side. My heart fell out of my chest. I stopped breathing. My arms fell limply to my sides, and despite my best efforts my jaw hung open. I stared at Bray, waiting for him to reveal that this was all some sick joke. Then again, he was never one to take things with humor. He nodded, regarding my demeanor. Like I said, I had assumed Samuel spoke to you of this. But they are his plans after all. My breathing quickened. What are you talking about? How do you know this? Peyton walked back around the counter, stopping to wipe away a spot of dew from his mug. The meeting Samuel held, of course. He told us of his plans for the future of the pack, which consequentially include you. I do have to say we were wary of you at first. But now that we have a date set for your shift, that should be well taken care of. He looked up at me. If his eyes weren't already an icy blue, I would have assumed the color was just for me. We are all quite excited. I was speechless. Bray ignored me for a moment, sitting back down on the bar stool and twirling to face me. His face held an expression of triumph, and he didn't try hard to hide it. Of course he continued. We are not all thrilled. I snapped at him. What is that supposed to mean? Some of us are worried about your ability to properly lead this pack. You would play a significant role at Samuel's side. Despite the other seasoned wolves around you, some might actually think that unfair. Why should I care what they think? Oh, you shouldn't. I quite agree with you there. He took a sip from his mug. I am only thinking of you here. I cannot imagine one such as yourself truly happy in these circumstances. I shifted on my feet, looking around the kitchen. Peyton followed my gaze, continuing. Samuel thinks otherwise. That is only to be assumed. He presumes you can help this pack. But I wonder, what do you think? It doesn't matter what I think, does it? My composure faltered. It's going to happen whether I like it or not. Peyton tilted his head toward me. I do suppose you are correct in that aspect. You have tried to run before and failed, of course. I held back a grimace. That doesn't have anything to do with this. On the contrary. He sat up, leaning towards me. Though I was several feet away, I felt his presence overpowering. It has everything to do with this. It seems you fail at everything you do, does it not? My mouth hung open with a vicious retort, but he plowed on, crushing my words. You ran and you failed. You even led the humans here because of that escapade. You attempted to help your brother and you got our alpha killed. If it weren't for you, this pack would be thriving, really. That's not your not. He smiled sadly. You are a burden, Samantha. A liability. It's a wonder Samuel has not forced your shift yet. You are powerless after all. No help to him, this pack, or your family for that matter. Your mother is dead, is she not? My initial reaction to his words was anger. Pure murderous anger. Then they sunk in and began to coincide with every thought I had of myself. The deep-rooted fears resurfaced. Every debilitating thought I had of my life was no longer in my mind alone but recognized by others. It wasn't all in my mind then. It was true. The evidence lay in the graves I created. My mouth was left hanging open. Peyton left his words dangling in the air. I didn't move and neither did he. He only stared at me while I kept my gaze trained on the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was all too much to process and I couldn't do it. Footsteps came up behind me. Shoes echoed on the hardwood floors, stopping just before they reached the kitchen. I knew who it was before he spoke. What's going on here? Samuel. Bray took his gaze off me and shifted it to the space behind my shoulder. I was just retrieving Samantha some water. She wandered in here whilst I was enjoying my late-night snack. Samuel moved forward and placed a hand lightly on my waist. I wanted to push him away. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. Bray was back to staring at me now. He was waiting for me to break. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of doing it in his presence. Let's have it then. Samuel held out his hand. The water bottle was suddenly flying through the air. Samuel caught it with ease, his other hand tightening around my waist. As soon as the water was caught, He turned me away. Bray called out as we retreated, his voice a sing-song sentence. Sweet dreams, Samantha. Chapter 52. Bite you. I folded my arms around myself, squeezing my eyes shut. My feet moved of their own accord, and before I knew what had happened, I was back inside my room. Samuel was still beside me, guiding me to sit on my bed. I did so without hesitation, barely resisting the urge to lie back and disappear into the blankets. Samuel held out the bottle of water to me. Here. I took it without a word, staring at his feet. When they didn't retreat, I lifted my gaze up to his face. I expected to find anger lying in wait, but what I saw was a mask. There was no emotion in Samuel's features. He was completely shut off. What were you doing down there? Samuel eventually asked me in a monotone voice. I don't know. You could have asked someone to bring you water. Or used one of those. He gestured to the pile of water bottles and uneaten food next to my bed. I know. You shouldn't be alone. It's not safe. I paused, then responded in a faint voice. I expected my tone to come out as harsh or hostile, but it was lifeless. I thought the pack liked me now, after what you said. Samuel stiffened. What did I say? My gaze traveled back up to meet his. When I looked into his eyes, he knew my answer. He didn't have to guess at what I was talking about. The mask cracked for a moment, and every thought he had was written plainly on his face. Oh, he sighed, cursing under his breath. That. Were you going to tell me? Or were you just going to wait until the full moon and then bite me? Samantha, I guess it would be easier to wait. I cut him off, my voice still faint. I wouldn't try to fight you or run that way. You could catch me off guard. Samuel shifted his weight. Let me explain. I shrugged. Then again, if you didn't wait, then the whole pack could see that you finally have me. I couldn't run that way either. I'd be forced to stay here until my shift was complete, or else I would probably die. If possible, my voice quieted further. I don't think you want me to die. My throat went tight and my voice cut off. Samuel took that moment to close the distance between us. He knelt in front of me, grabbing my face between his two hands. Stop. Just stop. He stared at me with a trembling expression. My own dead eyes caught all the emotion swirling in his. He wasn't angry with me, his eyes weren't threatening to turn colors. But there was an emotion just as strong as anger bubbling up to the surface and threatening to explode. What did Bray say to you? I shrugged and tried to pull my face away. My hands weakly tugged at his own. Samantha, Samuel took my attention back with a forceful tone. What did he say? Tears were forming in my eyes now. I didn't know how it was possible. After the past few days, I shouldn't have any tears left. But they were brimming nonetheless. At this point, I didn't have the strength to fight them. They blurred and distorted my vision with every blink. I almost wished the water wouldn't stop flowing, and would simply drown me. My hands stopped fighting. They rested on Samuel's, and now we were both cradling my face. His thumb traced small circles along my cheeks. I stared into his deep blue eyes, tormented with things unsaid, sure that my own reflected the same expression. Is it true? My question caught us both by surprise. A moment of silence passed. Then Samuel broke eye contact. He shifted his gaze to the floor and his hands dropped from my face. My head fell to my chest, and in the next moment, Samuel was walking to my door. I watched his retreating footsteps, my world crumbling around me. Never had I felt so betrayed. Never had I felt my heart so viciously ripped in two. But then I should have expected it. I should have known this was what would happen. In the end, I was nothing more than a weak and helpless human. I had done nothing to prove otherwise. Samuel had even told me countless times that I would not be human for long. And on top of that, I drove him away. I pushed and pushed at Samuel until he had finally cracked. It was only natural that he would change me into something he could love. It was only to be expected. I couldn't find it in me to be angry. I knew that was the normal reaction I would have at a moment like this, but in the end I was too broken to care. Bray's words were still ringing in my mind, and each step that Samuel took away from me only solidified that belief. Then his footsteps stopped. His hand hovered over the doorknob. I glanced up just in time to see the resolve pass along Samuel's features before he turned and crossed the room, back to me. He took me by the hand and raised me off the bed. I stumbled behind him, and when I did, Samuel lifted me into his arms. He carried me out of the room like that, swept up in his embrace. We traveled deeper into the hallways. We passed Will's room without a second glance and descended a flight of stairs that I never knew existed. The doors turned from wood to metal. The regular rooms were long behind us, now replaced with an entire hallway of reinforced shifting rooms. It was darker down here. Unlived in. Abandoned. Samuel stopped outside a particularly sturdy door. It was thicker than the rest with a large bar across the front. My blood ran cold as I stared at it. Samuel hesitated, and I could feel his heartbeat quicken with my own. His grip grew tighter, now holding me hostage rather than in an embrace. His muscles tensed and the mood shifted. Then suddenly I knew. This was where I would be deposited after Samuel bit me. This was where I would hope to die. This was happening now. Samuel opened the door. I began to struggle in his arms, the last bit of my fight resurfacing. I craned my neck to look into the room I was sure to meet my death, but Samuel walked backward through the door, limiting my vision to anything but his chest. I struggled harder at this point and began pushing against his shoulders with any strength I could muster. My legs flailed and I managed to land a solid kick to his shoulder. Samuel grunted and the next thing I knew I was falling. What I thought would be several feet was only a few inches. I landed on something soft, and when I looked down I saw it to be a thickly woven rug. Samuel backed away and I saw that the rug covered the entire room. Apart from it there was nothing else. A light bulb hung above, but there was no furniture. Not a chair, not a bed, not even a blanket. Samuel shut the door. I was engulfed in darkness. He began to walk back to me, but I scurried away until my back hit the wall. Then the room was illuminated once more. Samuel stood in the center, holding a string connected to the light bulb. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Leave me alone. He ran a hand down his face, pulling at the skin. Stop being dramatic. Just stay away from me. Samuel let go of the string and raised his hands toward me. I'm not moving. I faltered, not expecting his answer. Good, I eventually choked. My eyes searched the room for something to defend myself with. There was nothing. Nothing except the layer of dust we were both disturbing. Samuel noticed my search. He looked as if he wanted to roll his eyes, but after regarding my trembling frame, he thought better. Instead, he drooped his head and put on another expressionless mask. I'm not going to hurt you, Samantha. I glared up at him. Like hell you aren't. Stay away from me. He raised both of his arms, palms facing me. I'm not going to bite you. My chest heaved with my quickened breathing. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, breathing back what little life I had left. Samuel took the moment of silence to lower his hands and sit on the ground. He was still several feet away from me, but with him sitting on my level, my fear lessened slightly. I'm not going to bite you, he repeated. I'm not going to force you to shift. Maybe not right now, you're not. He tried catching my gaze. Not now, not ever. You what? Samuel spoke slower. I'm not ever going to bite you. I searched his face for deception, my heart still hammering in my chest. Then why would you bring me here? It's the most soundproof room in the house. So, people won't hear me scream when you finally kill me. My voice was strained and weak. Samuel bent his head. I don't want you dead, Samantha. You were right about that. Desperate tears were streaming down my cheeks again. I don't understand, I mumbled. I don't understand what's going on. Bray said I cut myself off. He narrowed his eyes. What did he say? I took a shaky breath, filtering through my conversation with Bray. He told me your plan. What you told the pack. He told me you're going to make me shift at the next full moon. My sentence broke off with a sob I hadn't realized was still lingering. Samuel flinched forward, arms outstretched. Then, he shook his head and retreated into himself. It's true. I did tell them that. My sob died off, replaced again by the aching emptiness of a betrayed heart. The knowledge of its imminence didn't diminish the hurt, and as I stared back at Samuel, I knew the truth. This was only him trying to offer consolation before he turned me. This was only his good-natured self, trying to give me a respite before the storm. I didn't mean it. I paused, my breath hitching in my throat. What? I didn't mean what I told them. It was a lie. But I trailed off. Why? It was a cover. Something to buy time. I had to tell them something. They needed information and reassurance. After everyone figured out about Riley, they needed it. So I told them I called the chiefs in. I told them I would be their alpha and you would be at my side as one of them." He paused and leaned forward, a silent plea forming on his face, begging me to believe his words. I didn't mean any of it. I spoke between heavy breaths. "I don't understand." Samuel shook his head and ran his hand through his hair. "You weren't even supposed to know about this. I didn't want to upset you again. Not after everything that happened." "When?" His gaze shot back up to me. "What? When? When did you tell them it was going to happen?" Samuel massaged his neck. 2 days. The night of Riley's funeral. My heart sunk. "And what's going to happen when they realize I'm still human?" "They won't." "What do you mean they won't?" "That's a little hard to hide." My voice rose in pitch. Hysteria was creeping in, and my mind refused to believe what Samuel was telling me. It was all some elaborate plan. It had to be. "You'll be gone by then." There was a moment of silence. A storm of emotions was blazing through me. My voice was no longer faint but creeping higher with every syllable. My entire being was stretched thin, and any wrong move could snap me in half. Finally I sighed, fighting for composure. "Stop lying to me. It's not doing me any favors." Samuel clenched his fists. "I'm not lying to you, Samantha. You're not going to turn. You and your brother will be gone before anyone realizes you're still human." I stalled. "What do you mean gone?" "Gone as in as far away from this place as possible." A spark of hope flickered into my chest. It was intoxicating. It was the first breath of air after staying underwater for far too long. It was laying down to sleep after spending days running through the woods. It was staring into Samuel's eyes, knowing he was telling the truth. "You're letting us go." Something flashed in Samuel's eyes. Before I could catch it, he turned his head. "Yes. The funeral will happen, you will run, and the chiefs will be here shortly after. I'll tell them in the pack you didn't survive the initial bite or you ran away or something. It doesn't matter. No one knows that we'll survived. It will be easy for you both to go." I exhaled a long breath. The world slowed until all activity ceased, waiting for my response. "Why? Why would you do this after all this time?" Samuel picked at the woven rug, pulling up stray pieces of string as he responded. "You weren't ever supposed to get hurt. No one was. This will stop that from happening again." He dragged his gaze back up to me. "All I ever wanted was for you to be happy, Samantha. I thought that if you had your family, if you could just see that He broke off, shaking his head. "If you could just see that this wasn't so bad, you could love it." He wanted to say more. His mouth hung open, lingering on his last 2 words. A moment passed, and his chest deflated. "I understand now that you can't be happy here." Again there was silence. Just like before. Samuel had a way of saying things that caused my heart to leap and break all in the same action, and when he was finished speaking and mulling over the conversation, I was left to catch up. I folded my arms around my body, clinging to what little reality I had left. "What about you?" He shrugged. "What about me? What's going to happen to you when they realize we're gone? What about Bray? The humans? James?" Samuel took a deep breath. "I'm pretty certain James is only after you or your mother. Once he thinks you're dead or gone, he'll give up. We haven't caught a whiff of the humans since the other night. I don't think they're the problem. And Bray." He smirked. It was sudden and in complete contrast to all other emotion he'd let slip through his mask. "I can handle Bray." An unbelieving laugh, mixed with heightening hysteria, escaped me. Samuel's smirk widened into an actual smile. We caught each other's eyes for a moment before he broke away. "You shouldn't worry about that anymore anyway. You'll be safe as soon as you're gone." My heart fluttered. Safe. It wasn't something I thought I could ever achieve. At least not here. Not ever again. But now, Samuel was giving me the opportunity to have that distant dream become a tangible reality. I bit my lip, closing my eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Samuel's tone darkened. "This isn't something you should be thanking me for. But I am. I know you could force me to stay here and shift, but you're not." He shrugged. "This is just what you deserve." Water stung my eyes. I shook my head, mostly to myself. Samuel was about to comment, but I quickly cut him off and blurted out my next words. "I'm sorry." He raised his eyebrows. "For what?" "Don't act dumb," I snapped. My emotions were everywhere. I was still reeling from what Samuel had just revealed to me. That, combined with the recent trauma concerning my family, caused my heart to go into overdrive. I was acting erratic, speaking before I knew what I was going to say, and digging myself a hole deeper than I ever thought possible. But there was no stopping it. There was no control. And for once I let it continue. I'm sorry for what I said the other night. Understanding washed over Samuel's features. He stared at me for a moment as I tried to hide the fact that I was shaking. I had avoided speaking of this or even thinking about it because every time I did I lost it. I still couldn't bring myself to believe that my mother was dead, and because of that, I couldn't bring myself to believe I'd accused Samuel of it being his fault. I knew that I lashed out in my grief. I knew that he was the closest person I could hurt, but that knowledge didn't stop me from doing it. Samuel stiffened. You don't have to apologize for your feelings. My voice came out small. I didn't mean it. It was Samuel's turn to fight the truth. Riley's not here, he sighed. You don't have to lie. I'm not lying. My body was noticeably shaking now. There was no more hiding. Samuel fought against himself for several moments before he stood up and walked closer to me. He paused a few steps away, gauging my reaction. Had this been any other day, I would have pushed him away. If I had any inkling of control left, I would have withdrawn further into myself and fought Samuel's comfort. But tonight, Samuel had revealed he was letting me go. Tonight I was too broken and confused to know what I wanted. Tonight I let him in. Samuel sat down next to me. His face was contorted into an expression that could be mistaken for agony, but I knew it to be uncertainty. He held out his arm just above my knee, waiting for me to flinch away. When I didn't, he almost withdrew himself. Then a stray tear slipped from my cheek and his arms were around me. My head buried into his shoulder and my knees fell onto his legs. Samuel gripped the back of my head with one hand, the other resting on my leg. He covered his face with my hair, and each time he breathed, the air traveled down my neck in chills. It wasn't right, I choked on my words, fighting to find the right ones. It wasn't your fault. You didn't know. It's okay, Samuel whispered into my hair. It's going to be okay. But I should have never, nobody deserves. Samuel hushed me, sending another warm breath down my neck. Each time I tried to speak after that, he would quiet my apologies and hold me tighter. After a while I stopped fighting that too. I grew limp in his arms, my breathing becoming heavier with every passing second. Samuel followed suit, and soon I couldn't bring myself to draw away from him. For that moment he was my rock, the one thing holding me to the earth, when all I wanted to do was sink beneath its surface. Chapter 53. It's possible we sat in that position for an unmeasurable amount of time. With no windows or natural lighting to tell the time of day, there was no way to gauge just how long we were locked in one another's embrace. It could have been minutes, hours, or days, and we wouldn't have known a difference. For just those moments, everything stood still. But then those moments ended. Reality came crashing back down. New worries, fears, and doubts laced my mind, and no matter how hard I pushed against them, they wouldn't leave me be. As time passed, my body grew tense. Samuel must have recognized the change because he soon sighed and released his hold on me. As soon as his arms were gone, my heart dropped further into my chest, and though Samuel was sitting right next to me, the room felt empty. Samuel rested his elbows on his knees and cradled his head. He titled it towards me, but I avoided eye contact. Tell me what's on your mind, he mumbled. I folded my arms around myself, searching for some of the comforts I felt just moments ago. It's never going to work. How can you be so sure? Because I've tried running before. And I've failed. That doesn't mean you will fail again. He nudged my shoulder. Plus this time I won't be getting in your way. A small smile crept onto my face. I met Samuel's gaze and held it for a long moment before my face fell. It's not just my life I'm risking this time though. I've got Will to think about now. Samuel slowly nodded. Two is better than one. You can help each other. Maybe I trailed off. But he's just gotten over the shift. He can barely lift his head. That should get better soon. His body just has to catch up with everything. Samuel ruffled his hair. He did an incredible job with the shift. I haven't seen anyone come out on the other side like that before. My mind flashed back to the images of Will in the clearing. It didn't seem incredible. I didn't say it was pretty, just that he handled it well. And what about next time? The The first is always the worst. I let out a short breath. Maybe, but I have no idea how to help him if it happens again. I paused and my voice grew small. Will it happen again? Yes. I bent my head, but Samuel quickly continued. It's who he is now, Samantha. There's no fighting it. He doesn't have to have it be as large a part of his life as it is mine or anyone else in this pack, but it will always be there. He reached out his hand and placed it on my knee. It was so lightly placed that I barely felt the contact. It will get better, though. He'll learn to live with it. Trust me. I wiped at my eyes and ran my hand under my nose. How do you know that? I won't be able to help him. If we're running away from wolves, there won't be any others to help him either. I don't know the first thing about any of this. My hands fell to my sides. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. Maybe we should just stay. No. Samuel's hand grew tighter on my knee. You both have to go. It's safer and you'll both be better off away from here. How is that true? How can Will get the help he needs? How will it ever work? Where would we even go? Samuel withdrew his hand. He groaned under his breath and looked up at the ceiling. Both of his hands massaged the back of his neck, and he seemed to be searching the ceiling for answers. After a moment of hesitation, he mumbled his response. I can help him if he stays. Of course I can. If that's what you truly want, then I will make it work. But that's not the only option. I shook my head. What other options are there? He took a deep breath before settling his gaze on me. His hand still cradled his neck. You want to avoid the wolves? Well, yes, but I don't see how that's possible with Will now. It's possible. I waited for an answer, but Samuel never gave me one. He searched my eyes instead, conflict on raging behind his own. His mouth hung open with every word he held back. How? I eventually whispered. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then his hands dropped and he stood. Come with me. The next moments happened in a blur. I followed Samuel out of the room and back into my own. He left me there for a few moments, instructing me to wait for him to come back. Sure enough, a few minutes later, he walked through my bedroom door with my shoes and one of his jackets. He had already changed into warmer clothes and was wearing shoes as well. What's going on? He gave me my shoes and held onto the spare jacket as I put them on. I need to show you something. There was little other conversation as I laced up my shoes and took Samuel's jacket. When I was sufficiently drowning in it, he took me by the hand and led me out of my room once more. The house was still as quiet as ever, and we saw no one as we trekked through the hallways. Samuel led us to the back door, where he hesitated. Don't leave my side, okay? Just for tonight. I faltered. Where would I go? A ghost of a smile graced Samuel's lips. He opened his mouth to say something, shook his head and dropped his gaze. Instead, he turned to the door and opened it, pulling me through the exit. The night was dark, though lighter than before. The sun was still nowhere in sight, but the moon was not as high in the sky. We both hopped into a truck, where Samuel put the car in drive without turning it on. He stood outside the driver's door and steered the car, pushing it until we were far enough away not to disturb the house with the sound of the engine. I tried to get out and help at one point, but after a sharp look from Samuel, I settled into the seat. When we were finally driving down the road, I couldn't help my eyes from shutting. The hum of the engine lulled me into sleep and I was in no condition for a fight. Samuel urged me to shut my eyes for a few minutes, and to my surprise I did. When I awoke it was only a short time later. The sky hadn't changed, but our surroundings had. We were back in the middle of town, parked outside Samuel's apartment building. He didn't say anything as he jumped out of the car and came to open my door for me. I took his hand and didn't release it as we walked into the brick building. Even as we walked into the large building, Samuel kept quiet. He would shoot glances my way, but every time I would look at him he'd flinch back. He never dropped my hand though, and for once I didn't force him away. Whether out of anxiety or a need for comfort I didn't know. We walked through the corridors of the apartment building, hand in hand, without saying a word. My mind was racing with the possibilities of what Samuel wanted to show me, but I kept my curiosity inside. I could tell Samuel was deep in thought and fighting against himself. Whatever this was, he didn't want me to know, but for whatever reason, he decided to show me. We rounded the last corner and Samuel's red door came into view. His step faltered as we both stared at it. I tried to hold back my sudden smile at the wide-eyed expression Samuel adorned. "What did you do to my door?" A small laugh sounded from my lips, surprising us both. I hadn't realized until now, but Samuel hadn't been back to his apartment since the night Raven and I escaped to go after Will. Because of this, he hadn't seen the damage we'd done and the large splintering hole that was once a perfect door. "It's just a small hole. Easy fix." Samuel shook his head, glancing down at me. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to fix it. And you are." He shot me a smirk. "I'll just replace it. I never liked the red anyway." Before I could counter his remark, he pulled on my hand again. We both stepped over the pieces of wood littering the hallway, and once inside the apartment we had to do the same. Samuel sighed under his breath at this, shaking his head when he thought I wasn't looking. The rest of the apartment was still the same. The kitchen on the right, my bedroom at the far end, the pristine living room to my left, and Samuel's room beyond that. I'd snooped around in there my first few days while trapped in this apartment, but I had never found anything to help me escape. Now I wished I looked harder. Samuel led me to the couch, where he sat me down and hesitated, glancing away. "Just sit here a minute." I did as I was told, watching Samuel's figure retreat into his bedroom. He left the door open and I could hear him grunting, pulling at things and throwing them around. Just as I was about to abandon the couch and help him, he re-emerged into the living room, holding a large cardboard box. My curiosity was practically burning now. All I wanted was for Samuel to rip open the box and dump the contents so I could know exactly what it was that was so important to show me. However, like with everything else, Samuel had thought this through. He sat down next to me, placing the box next to his legs and out of my line of vision. The lid was closed, so there was no way I could glimpse inside. Just as I was leaning around him to try, Samuel placed a gentle hand on my chin and brought my gaze back to his. The look on his face stilled any further movement. His eyes were shining, with tears, apprehension, or some other emotion I couldn't tell. Nonetheless, they had me enthralled. With one glance, there was nothing else in this room but him. Samuel kept my gaze, his lips barely moving with the words he spoke. "I have to show you something, and I don't want you to be upset with me." "Why would I be? I haven't been completely honest with you." He broke away, dropping his hand. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "Do you think I'm going to be upset?" He hesitated. "I don't know." My hand was shaking, but I raised it to his face, pulling his gaze back to me. "There's one way to find out." Samuel gave me a small smile, then turned to the box. I resisted the urge to look, letting him take control of the moment. There was a method to his madness, and maybe if I played along it would make sense. He turned back to me, holding a picture frame. A reminiscent smile fell upon his features. He glanced up at me, back to the frame, then closed his eyes for a moment. Finally, he held it out. I took it with a careful grip. As soon as my hand grasped the black wood, dust caked my fingertips. I ignored it and instead turned the frame over to stare at the picture inside. It was a woman. She had her arms around 3 children, gathering them in until their shoulders were squashed together and cheeks touching. She was laughing while the 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, were grimacing. The 4 of them were in front of a lake, standing huddled together close to the edge of the water. Despite the miserable expressions of the children, you could tell they were enjoying themselves. Their arms wrapped around each other and legs tangled until you couldn't distinguish which belonged to who. There was a light in their eyes as well, one that screamed of youthfulness and carefree days. My grip tightened around the picture. I studied the features of each of the people in the photograph, my eyes narrowing as I did. There was no discounting I was staring at a family. They all had dark hair and similar facial structures, though the girls had narrower eyes and jawlines. The boy was all too familiar. Even at a young age, I could distinguish the dark blue eyes, wide nose, and tousled hair. My gaze shot up to Samuel. He was an older version of the boy in the picture, though countless things were different. His skin had lines that were becoming more and more permanent with added stress. His eyes were darker. He didn't have the innocent grin. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words would come out. However, Samuel knew what I was trying to say. "That's my family." Chapter 50 For Your Family. Song Sleepstar. I was wrong, my jaw gaped. "Your family?" Samuel grimaced. then tried to hide it with a smirk. That's what I said. I dropped my gaze back to the picture in my hand. But you always told me that. I trailed off, uncertain of my words. That the pack was my family, Samuel finished. I nodded and he continued staring at the picture with me. It's true. The pack is my family. But this, I pointed to the woman. This has to be your mother. And these girls, I trailed off again, my finger lingering on their faces. My younger sisters. Twins if you couldn't tell. I let out a breathy laugh. Twins. I stared at the two girls in the photo, mesmerized. They both wore their hair in pigtails. One of them was missing both of her front teeth, while the other was sticking her tongue at the camera. Samuel smiled. Ava and Belle. They look just like your mother. My thumb ran along her features. She had dark hair that was cut short just above her cheeks. Her chin was pointed, her nose small, but her eyes were wide. She had wrinkles lining her features, but they did nothing but add beauty to her age-stricken face. They took her name too, or at least part of it. Bella. I looked up to see Samuel gazing down at the picture, lost in thought. Belle would always argue that she was the favorite because she had more of Mom's name, he laughed. But Mom would tell Ava that there was a V in Bella. You just couldn't tell because it was silent. I watched Samuel from the side of my eye. He was still staring at the picture, a far-off look escaping his eyes. Though a smile was plastered on his cheeks, there was another expression threatening to take over. Samuel abruptly laughed and looked at me. Those girls would argue about anything. A smile cracked my features, and for a moment Samuel and I were lost in the two girls. Then his face fell back to the frame, and I was reminded that we were only looking at a picture. Before I could ask any questions, Samuel was shaking his head and reaching into the box again. I look more like my dad, he told me. Another picture was placed on my lap. This one had Samuel a little older, though he was still just a boy. He was standing under the shoulder of another man. Samuel nearly reached his height, and the two almost looked as if they could be brothers. The older man had a thick beard lining his wide-set jaw and black hair that was slicked back. His eyes were sunken in, and as far as I could tell, their color was the only difference between the two. Where Samuel's eyes matched his mother, his father had bright, green ones. I glanced up to see another glint in Samuel's eyes. This time a liquid was pooling at the edges. Just as I was about to reach out to him, he turned back to the box. He dug around for a moment, and by the time he was facing me again, all liquid was gone from his eyes. Another picture was placed in my lap on top of the previous two. This photograph held the entire family. They were sitting around a dinner table, mouths hanging open with laughter. The twins were still in high chairs, but Samuel sat on his father's lap. The family was staring at their mother, Bella. Her mouth was open and her eyes were wide. A pile of food was sliding down her face and onto her neck. Samuel's father, the clear culprit, had his head thrown back in laughter. Samuel was staring at him in awe. A wide smile filled my face. You all look so happy. I didn't have to look up to know that Samuel, for a moment, held the same expression. We were. A comfortable silence filled the room. I knew there was a but coming to Samuel's statement. If there wasn't, he would still be with his family. However, I didn't push him. This was something he needed to get out on his own. Eventually, Samuel sighed. He took the frames from my lap and replaced them with a final picture. This one was bigger than the others, and the leather lining was worn down around the edges. This was the last picture taken of the five of us. They were all older. Samuel was beginning to grow into himself, and the twins were past the frilly dress phase. Their parents had more wrinkles, and though you couldn't tell at first glance, their shoulders were sunk in. They put on a happy face though. The five of them were in front of the same lake in the previous picture, though this time wading in the water. My gaze left the picture and slowly traveled back up to Samuel. He was already staring at me. Why would this make me upset? He shook his head. This isn't everything. He fished once again into the cardboard box. This time he put a pile of frameless pictures onto my lap. I flipped through them, growing more and more confused with each one. They were all pictures of wolves. Packs of them, individuals, light, dark, and in between. There was one wolf that was lingering in almost all of the pictures. A tall brown and black creature with shining green eyes. My father, Samuel explained. He was an alpha. The forest pack. Most people call them the greenies, though. I flipped through the pictures a few more times, searching for a familiar wolf. However, I never found the blonde and caramel-colored fur I was looking for. Nor did I see any red eyes. Samuel caught my search. "You won't find me." My hands paused. "Why not?" He took a deep breath. I waited for him to continue. He folded his hands in his lap, shifting his weight and picking at his nails. His gaze would no longer meet mine. My heart throbbed. Samuel was unsure and uncomfortable. 2 words I never would have used to describe him. I almost didn't want to ask him to continue. But at the same time I knew it needed to happen. Something he was holding back would fit all the pieces of the puzzle together. "Samuel." My pleading voice was soft. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, ignoring me. My brow furrowed. I reached out my hand to catch his own, if only to stop his nervous picking. When my skin touched him, his entire body stilled. His eyes fluttered open, and he stared at me. "I'm not going to hate you," I promised. "I'm sure I've hated you for much less than this, and I'm not going to do it again." My voice grew small. "You don't deserve that." Hesitant relief overcame his features. He nodded a few times, took another breath, then opened his mouth. "You won't find me in those pictures because I wasn't a wolf then. I didn't get the gene. My sisters didn't either." He paused and bowed his head. "We were all human." My eyes went wide. My heart skipped several beats. Samuel stared at me, watching all this happen. His eyes flitted over my body several times, waiting for me to respond. A worry line appeared between his brow, and it only deepened with each passing minute of silence. He waded through it, though, never pushing me to answer. Countless thoughts and emotions swarmed my mind. I couldn't hold on to any one of them. There was shock, disbelief, anger, betrayal, and finally confusion. "How?" I breathed, though it came out as more of a shriek. "Thought." "No one knows," he quickly interrupted, tensing his shoulders. "At least not very many people. Riley knew. He was the one who helped me with my first shift. Eden knew because she was with him. Marshall found out after my first shift. He was the one who made sure I didn't die from it. I think Goldie put the pieces together over the years. Apart from that, no one ever knew. We made sure of it." My mouth was dry. Things were falling into place. Comments, conversations, and side glances started making sense. Through it all, I could do nothing but stare at Samuel as he attempted to explain. "Riley always wanted me to be his beta," he continued. "So he never let anyone know I was human. If they knew, I never would have been able to hold that position. The pack just assumed I didn't connect well with my wolf." I was still speechless. My entire world was shifting. Samuel kept staring at me, waiting for me to respond, but I couldn't even think, much less form a coherent sentence. "Please say something," Samuel begged, oblivious to my inner struggle. Something between a laugh and cry escaped my lips. The noise was strangled, so I cleared my throat and spoke the next thought that ran through my mind. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" He took a breath and hung his head. "I know I should have. I was just..." He trailed off, leaving his mouth hanging open. The word was on the tip of his tongue, but only after he glanced at me did he dare say it. I was scared. I didn't want to give you another reason to hate me. I thought that if I told you, you would just think it was a plot for me to make you shift. Or you would use it against me. If anyone knew about this." He trailed off, leaving the explanation to the imagination. I shook my head slowly. "I wouldn't use this against you." "I know," he mumbled. "I know that now." I started flipping through the pictures, this time searching for another wolf. I had only seen Riley's wolf once before, but I doubted I would forget it. However, after a moment, I realized he wasn't in the pictures either. "That was my dad's pack," Samuel explained after catching my confused glance. "Riley and his family were never a part of it." I took a deep breath, then put the pictures down and really looked at Samuel. He was watching me with caution, expecting a blow-up at any moment. If our past conversations were any comparison, I should be screaming at him by now. But tonight I couldn't find it in me. I wasn't angry, I was confused. "What happened?" Samuel bent his head again. His frame grew stiff and he hid his face from my view. "I was 12, he breathed. "It was my family, the 5 of us against the world. Nothing could change that. We were a normal and happy family. Apart from Dad being a wolf and all." He paused and didn't speak for a long time. When he opened his mouth again, his voice changed. It was no longer hesitant, but heavy and laden down with painful memories. It was around the time the wolves decided to come out to the world. Dad didn't approve of it. He couldn't understand why everyone wanted to do it. At that point it was the consensus that it was what was best for them, I guess. Samuel shook his head. Dad spoke out against it. First people listened. He tried to use his family, us, as an example of the harmony we could have with humans. There didn't have to be hatred. We could work. He paused and his voice softened. We did work. He glanced up at me. When he saw I was listening, he let out a harsh breath and continued. People stopped listening. Other packs claimed Dad had gone soft. That's when the threats started. They were small at first, but they got bigger. They knew Dad was against it all, and without his support, he was the enemy. We tried to run. We took a few that still were loyal to my dad and disappeared. We made it as far as the northern border before they found us. Before we could get out and get help, we were cut off. There were too many of them. Warriors from 5 different packs came to stop us. I guess they thought that without his support my dad would ruin their cause. We were all a threat. In the end we didn't stand a chance. We fought though. We fought long and hard. We almost thought we would win. Samuel's voice cracked, and he stared off into an unknown space. I slowly reached out my hand to touch his knee, unsure of what other comforts I could give. He relaxed at my touch, but his expression didn't follow suit. His eyes were hidden underneath his brow. His lips pulled into a permanent frown. Everything changed when Dad died. It took 4 men to pull him down. When people saw he was gone, their resolve was just gone with him. At that point, people started running. The other packs went after them. My mother told me to take my sisters and run, but we couldn't. We couldn't leave her. She tried hiding us. There were so many people, so much chaos, we all thought we could wait it out. Maybe if we were quiet they would think we died. Samuel sighed and looked out the window. It didn't work. They found all of us. One of them snapped at my sister and I jumped in between. Got my leg. With the full moon being so close, the effects were almost instant. As if reliving the memory, Samuel rubbed the skin just beneath his knee. His face was contorted in pain, but his eyes were far away. When he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. They were ready to kill us all. They were about to do it. But one of them saw that I was bitten. They tried to take me, but I wouldn't go without a fight. At that point, they were all too exhausted to put up with it. They'd lost people too. We used to be friends, family after all. He took a shaky breath before continuing. I was able to convince them to leave everyone else alone, and they could take me instead. In the end, the humans weren't worth their energy. I had my father's blood running through me, and they knew if they could get me on their side, they would have an advantage at one point. Couldn't have the father, so they took the son. Samuel scoffed, disgust forming on his features. Then he caught my eye and softened. I went with them. Back with Riley's father to Crimson Eye. The rest of my family left, and I haven't spoken to them since. He pressed his lips together until they were set in a thin line. He closed his eyes, dropped his head and muttered, I don't even know if they're alive. Without thinking, my hand tightened around Samuel's. He was limp in my hold, but I didn't let that deter me. I sat with him for several moments in nothing more than a somber silence. The air was heavy in the room and it was almost hard to breathe. My thoughts raced with images of Samuel's family, torn apart by the very thing that sent my own family's life spiraling into hell. Samuel eventually opened his eyes and stared into my own. He blinked rapidly and pressed his lips together. Tears pooled in the corners of his eyes, but he held them at bay for as long as he could. When opened his mouth to say something, his words died off and a mangled cry escaped. Without thinking, I pulled Samuel into me. He crumpled. Lifeless limbs fell on my own, and were it not for the couch bearing most of the burden, I would have fallen under his weight. Samuel leaned his head against my shoulder and stayed there until the jacket I was wearing was damp with tears. Even then he didn't pull away. He simply mumbled incoherently into my shoulder. My hands wrapped around his neck and shoulder while my fingers played with the hair at the base of his neck. I'm so sorry, Samuel, I whispered. Not your fault. His broken voice rumbled in my shoulder. He pulled his head away for just a moment, looking into my eyes. When I saw his expression, the last of my heart shattered. He was broken. His entire being was broken. Everything Samuel had been holding in and shoving away made its way to the surface and exploded into his expression. His eyes were bloodshot. His mouth hung open. This time, though, there were no words to be said. There were only tears to finally be let free. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, breaking away his gaze. He acted as if he was going to say more, but I cut him off. "If you're going to apologize for crying, then just stop right there." I shook my head. My hand curled against the back of his neck. The pressure sent Samuel's eyes back to my own. After holding his stare for a moment, I gave him a sad smile. "It's okay to miss them. It's okay to cry." Samuel tried speaking, but his words came out choked. I shook my head again and pulled him back into my shoulder, muffling his voice. He stopped trying to speak and went still. His shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths, but apart from that, he was motionless. It seemed he would stay that way for an eternity. While sitting there on the couch, holding Samuel close to me, my world began to shift. For the first time since I could remember, I was not the one crying or needing comfort. Samuel was. And it wasn't for some menial sorrow or hardship that he was breaking. It was because he had been too strong for too long. At that moment, everything changed. My view, my world, my life. Every resentment I'd been holding on to seemed insignificant. Each fight I'd had with Samuel was meaningless. He wasn't a harsh monster that wanted to keep me locked away to cater to his happiness. He didn't have some selfish or domineering motivation to keep me close to him. It wasn't him that caused my life to go to hell, because the thing that did had ruined his life long before mine. Samuel wasn't an enemy. He was a weak and vulnerable man who had lost everything. He was just trying not to lose anything else. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.